HIPAA does a phenomenal job of protecting privacy, right? There's no doubt about that. It has made, over the decade or more that it's been in existence, it has made providers much more acutely aware of health information, protected health information, their patients' privacy rights, and our responsibilities. If you talk to providers and you talk to entrepreneurs, right, the people who are trying to collaborate in this new mHealth ecosystem, neither side is particularly happy with HIPAA. And I think everybody knows that. The number one complaint that I hear and that many people share is that HIPAA is not particularly flexible. I find that ironic because the law was originally written and has so far been written so that it is supposed to be very flexible, right? You assess your risk, you put in a plan to mitigate that risk, and you can do that whatever way you wish as long as you have a plan to show that you have properly assessed and mitigated risk. So it is ultimately flexible, but because it's prescriptive, it leaves both small companies and large organizations wondering, what am I really supposed to do to comply? And so I think what HIPAA really could benefit from is some level of prescriptiveness, some baseline level of this is acceptable. In particular, this affects those people outside of healthcare trying to get into the industry, if you will. And by that I mean the startups and the other companies trying to leverage technology for healthcare. So many startups have almost no concept of HIPAA when they begin to make a device that they want to sell to healthcare providers such as ourselves. And when they hear about how expansive these regulations are and that there's no manual they can open up in 10 steps they can take to be compliant, it becomes very overwhelming very quickly and often scares them away from selling to providers like us. And so I think what you're seeing is an ecosystem develop outside of traditional healthcare, right? Devices and websites and connectivity beginning to form, but away from the traditional covered entities of HIPAA, so that companies are free to innovate quickly, are free to build connections between each other and build interconnections between each other without running afoul of these regulations. And so you see, so many companies saying, no, we don't sell to hospitals, we sell direct to consumers to avoid that whole becoming ensnared under the covered entity and their business, the required business associate agreements and everything else. So if HIPAA could do anything, I think it could expand, you won't hear too many healthcare people say this, expand to make sure that people delivering these services that are like healthcare, but maybe outside of traditional covered entities, still do it in a thoughtful way and deliver the kind of privacy protections that consumers would expect, while at the same time becoming a little bit less difficult for those of us who are covered entities to implement, and a little bit more flexible in our ability to partner with people and build ecosystems between companies. The rule is so new. It's so expansive. 600 pages of an omnibus rule incorporating HIPAA, high tech, and other Reinvestment Recovery Act changes is going to take years to really understand fully. Under the original rules, we had to form these business associate agreements with our partners and basically ask them to protect your health information the same way we would. Under the original rules, the covered entity was subject to penalties if that privacy was breached. Under the new rules, all of the penalties and all of the potential audits from the Department of Health and Human Services now flow down to a business associate, where they did not before. And so, in other words, if I had signed a business associate agreement years ago and one of my contractors violated that agreement, it was a civil matter essentially between me and my contracted partner. Now that partner has opened themselves up to all of the full force of the penalties and requirements that HHS would normally have put onto us. Partners Healthcare is a multi-billion-dollar integrated delivery network, and we have lawyers and privacy officers and security officers, and we can sort of handle that. We have very robust procedures and protections in place. But in many cases in the STEM health world, I'm trying to sign contracts with startup companies that may have a few employees and a lawyer that they have on retainer when they need. And they're in no way, shape, or form able to withstand or perform the duties necessary under these new audits. And so what is happening is many of the small companies with whom I would like to do business are being advised by their counsel, absolutely not. Do not sign a business associate agreement. You do not want to be liable for an audit by the Office of Civil Rights Enforcement, and just don't touch it with a 1,000-foot pole. So this is becoming a very stifling issue, this expansion of the potential audits and fines and penalties flowing into the millions of dollars for a breach that most small startup or even small to medium-sized businesses want nothing to do with. And so it's really making it very difficult for large covered entities now to find partners to do innovative work. The second piece has to do a little bit with that, and has to do with what is or is not, as you mentioned, a reportable incident, it's called. So if there's a breach of information, if information is somehow exposed or lost, under the old rules there were some language to decide whether or not that was necessary to report to the Department of Health and Human Services or to the patients themselves, having to do with whether or not there was a risk of significant harm. That language has been taken out of the new rules as far as I've seen, and again, I need to fully digest them. But it basically says that a breach is a breach, and they're all reportable now. And that is also a huge liability risk for many small companies, especially when they're dealing with things that might seem less significant in the world of privacy. So I think those are the two parts of the new rule that are of most significance, and ones that are really having an effect on our ability to build sort of an ecosystem of companies and an ecosystem of technology.
Right.
Um, Honestly, I don't expect to see much on the HIPAA front for a while now, right? With the omnibus, with the release of these omnibus rules covering high tech requirements, I think HHS is done for a while. Their mandate, their push from Congress has been to enforce existing rules rather than necessarily overhaul the system. What I suspect we'll see is that HHS will become more aggressive in its enforcement. We've seen that directive come down from Congress. We've seen funding provided. We've seen outside firms hired by HHS to put together their auditing infrastructure. And I expect what's going to happen is that as those audits are conducted, issues will bubble up, and we will finally begin to get some regulatory adjudication of these concerns, whether it's, covered entities and HIPAA having discussions, arguments, if you will, about what is and what is not appropriate risk. And I expect over the next few years, some of those are going to wind their way through the court system. And that is something that has been sorely lacking in HIPAA for a long time, because enforcement was not robust for a while. There have been very few court cases or other very few regulatory actions that have resulted in concrete ideas of what is or is not acceptable under the regulations. I think as we see enforcement step up, this is going to become a regulatory and a judicial process for a while, more than it is a rewrite. We'll let the courts weigh in, we'll let some other regulatory bodies weigh in, and the standard sort of adjudication processes weigh in to really define the existing rules rather than overhaul them.
Okay.
The first piece is an interesting one, right? Because email has been around for so long, you'd think, and HIPAA's been around since '96, you'd think we would have figured this out by now. But you're right, we have not. In general, the concern is exactly what, as you stated, what happens once that email reaches a covered entity, and how do we treat it after that? The traditional reaction of healthcare has been to do exactly what you said, restrict access of patients in order to prevent that email from just sitting in an inbox and being breached as part of an email system breach. I do think you're going to see some changes there. Patients are demanding more contact with their physicians. They are emailing whether we like it or not. And your reaction can be to bury your head in the sand, or your reaction can be to try and figure out a way to deal with it. So I believe we will see some technologies that are capable of better securing these provider inboxes, or at least giving providers an easy way of moving that information and that data into a more secure area. At the center, for example, one of the projects we're working on right now is a company that has an app that allows patients to take readings from their glucose meter, if they're diabetic, and email them to a provider. They're doing that, whether we prescribe. And so we're working very hard on building a system that will allow that app to send it to a standard place and have that information immediately stripped out of the email and put someplace safer and then routed appropriately. So I suspect we're not alone. Prescribing apps is interesting, and I'm not sure that HIPAA really has much to say in this area if we want to stay on that topic. That gets more into the practice of medicine and other regulatory issues and FDA and licensure issues and state and other issues. I do think providers are recommending apps for patients. I don't think I know providers are recommending apps for patients. And just sort of saying that what a patient then does with that app, if they choose to use it and they choose to put data in it and they choose to share that data, they can do that as they wish. At a conference several years ago, I really wish I remember who said this. It's one of my favorite quotes ever. A provider standing on stage pointed out that patients are unencumbered by the regulatory process. And I think that's true. They're going to email us, and we just have to figure out a way to deal with it. And they're going to use apps, and they're going to share that data with whomever they choose to share it, and we're going to have to figure out a way to deal with it. So I'm not sure. It's certainly not going to be stifled. And finally, are portals a way of dealing with this? The IT person in me says yes. The end user in me says no. What we at the center have learned over a decade or more of research is that patients wish to interact with their healthcare system in whatever way makes sense in their lives. And for many people, portals no longer make sense. I'm talking to you on a laptop, which is a mobile device, if you will, on a wireless network. I have not had a desktop computer at work or at home in over a decade. And so the idea of a web page that I access through a secure desktop computer is probably gone. I'll give you an interesting quote. I have an 8-year-old daughter. We were having a conversation around the table with her grandmother, my mother-in-law, and my daughter said something about, I did this on the web at school. And my mother-in-law asked her, said, what is the World Wide Web? What is the web? And my 8-year-old said, oh, well, it's a computer thing that you access on either an iPod Touch or an iPhone or a tablet. Not once did she mention a traditional computer.
Right.
And I think that says everything I need to know about the future of interface design and the future of the way patients are going to interact with us. Right? Her generation and the teenagers today and the young adults today, they want a mobile experience. And the idea of a portal that they need to sit down on a big screen to interact with just doesn't make sense to many people anymore. So I think portals are an interim step at best, and we're going to have to sort out how to do this over mobile channels more securely very quickly. In the current environment, the most prudent choice is to say you can't do that. From a regulatory perspective, from a privacy perspective, from a control perspective. If you take the information security hard line, that information existing outside of a controlled system is presumed breached. People take their devices off-site and they're their personal devices. That information is presumed breached. But again, our experience at the center comes back, and over a decade or more, our job has been to use technology and introduce technology on both sides of the healthcare equation, to patients and providers, and get them to interact in these non-traditional ways. And perhaps the number one lesson we have taken away is that we have to put that technology into somebody's normal pathway. BJ Fogg is a researcher on the way people interact with information systems. He runs a persuasive technology lab at Stanford University. And he boiled this down to a very simple rule, which is if you want to change behavior with technology, you need to put hot triggers in the pathways of motivated people. And for most people, their pathway, their current pathway, the things that they use most often, the way to reach them is their own personal mobile device. They have it with them when they wake up. They put it next to their bed when they go to sleep. They carry it with them all day. That's what they want to use. To ask them to come into work, put that down, pick up something else, learn how to use a different interface is, in the long run, a losing battle. So again, I think this is a matter of what we have now and what we have later. Now it does seem the risks of breaches are high. The ability to control information on personal devices is so limited that from an IT perspective, the prudent decision is to just say no. But that is a losing strategy in the long term, right, without question. And so there's an opportunity for people to help us figure out a way to fix this. I think there are companies that are farther ahead than we are here in the United States. I know, for example, in many nations, cell phones are shared among many members of a family, and there are companies that have figured out ways to compartmentalize that information between users. And I don't see why something similar could not exist on devices that we have here. Why can I not walk into a hospital, have my iPad recognize it's on the hospital's Wi-Fi network, and open up a small encrypted compartmentalized piece of information, interact with those systems that when I'm not connected to that network, for instance, is re-encrypted and just put aside and not accessible to the main part of the operating system. That has to be technically possible. I think you're right. There is a way to embed or encrypt and protect data from the device itself all the way through. As far as older devices go, there's some concerns, but most of them are not wireless. And so, wired connections are less of an issue for us. Patients using a device, they plug it into their computer and don't delete the files off the computer. That's sort of outside traditionally be a worry for a covered entity. Where I think the future lies is in figuring out ways to do this without having to exchange PHI. So for example, older devices are a concern for us because in many cases they were built using HL7 interfaces, and in order to make those work, I had to share with my partner the identity of a patient. We had to set them up as if I was, enrolling them in our hospital. There are new devices coming to market now where that identification is not necessary, where the only identifiable piece of information that may exist on a device is the serial number of the device itself. And if I can keep that database locked down, tightly secured on a server inside my system, then really over those outside communications link, nothing identifiable being transmitted at all. And I think that's where the future of this goes. Rather than trying to figure out how to lock things down tighter, the question is, can we get useful information from people without having to constantly exchange identifiable pieces of data?
Right. Okay.
So that's where the concern of older devices exists. Many of them still require identifiable information to make them work. And so I think we're all actively trying to phase that out of our plans as much as possible.